From the swinging 60s, through the 1980s, into the 90s, the 2000s, and beyond, Spider-Man has had a rich history in animation. Thankfully, that has led to a ton of toys. Let's dig into an overflowing mystery box of some of the best Spider-Man action figures inspired by his cartoons.
Oh man, this box is like packed to the brim. So before we get started on some of the Spidey animated series figures, I want to give you just a little bit of a history lesson, and I'm going to use this Secret Wars Spidey as the example. So I grew up in the 1980s, which was an outstanding time to be a kid. We had G.I. Joe, we had Star Wars, we had He-Man, and we had a little bit of superheroes, but in the 80s, everything had to be related to some kind of media component. You had to have like a Saturday afternoon cartoon, or you had to have a major movie. And the only reason why we got this figure, which was really the only 1980s Spider-Man figure that existed, was because of the Secret Wars comic tie-in. So figures were actually really limited as far as superheroes goes. You had the Superpowers line and you had Secret Wars, but that was it. And it really wasn't until the 1990s when Toy Biz took over that we started to get superhero figures. And this is the first Spider-Man in the Marvel superheroes line. And oh man, I mean, you can see that sculpt is really terrible. I mean, those proportions don't look anything like the package, but it was happening. We were starting to get superheroes. Now, Toy Biz pretty rapidly improved. I mean, look at the difference in the sculpt of this figure that came out quickly afterwards, and also all of the added articulation that came. But I bring this up just to say what a great time it is that we live in an era where Marvel Legends is cranking out figure after figure, obscure characters, and there's no tie-in involved. You know, we just keep getting new toys. So just wanted to say how thankful I am for that, because Toy Biz, they really got rolling with their animated lines. The X-Men animated line that expanded into X-Force and X-Factor and all of those, and of course the Spidey animated line. And this is the creme de la creme Spider-Man of that line, the superposable Spidey. And it does look like it stepped right out of the cartoon. Now look at what they've done here. This is in a day where figures were 5 points of articulation. I mean, look at this Prowler figure. He's got, maybe 7 points because he's got knees, he's got elbows, but there's no ball joints anywhere. Yes, he does have a cool play feature. His claws will snap in and pop out. That's awesome. He's got a great sculpt and really great colors. I love this cape. But from an articulation standpoint, it's pretty basic. And that's what we're going to see with the vast majority of these animated figures. But they went all out with this Spidey. Look at the range of motion at his diaphragm swivel. He's got a waist, he's got ball hips and shoulders, and even look, we get mad about pinned joints. These are like metal riveted joints, but they actually gave us good wrist articulation, even metal ankle articulation. So to give you an idea of how far we've come, but also how much could be achieved, I figured this action figure cost a lot more to produce, but they really dedicated to it. And so this is our creme de la creme, a number one animated Spidey figure. But thankfully, we got all of this. Now, when the Spidey line launched, they had a Happy Meals giveaway that went with it. And look, here's like Hobgoblin, Spidey in a Spidey buggy. Here's a Venom one. And these are obviously kids' toys. I mean, these are Happy Meal toys. But with that, they also gave us some actual figures. We got Spider-Man, Mary Jane, and this really sweet animated version of Doc Ock. So this is the look that Doc had in the 90s animated cartoon with this kind of yellow and green. But these tentacles bend a little bit. They're kind of fixed, but they bend a little bit. Man, this is pretty sweet for coming out of a Happy Meal, can't lie. Now, let's get into some of these other figures. So let's begin with Kraven. So Kraven is a great example of the animated line. He has that standard articulation. He's got good paint. He's got really good sculpt. Look at that mane that's sculpted in there. But, he's very much in the animated style. And we're going to see a lot of figures that continue along this route. Here is the gigantic Kingpin. Think about the fact that they put a giant fat man in a white suit on the shelves. And of course, he's got some kind of like karate chop action, something that'll, let him to slam down on your Spidey figure. But look at that teeny tiny little pea head. Now, obviously, we've gotten a newer Kingpin on the retro card back, which is incredible. But this was at Walmart. They put this out. They really tried to reach all the different figures that were in that Spider-Man line. I don't love the head sculpt of this Hobgoblin, but I really love how accurate the rest of it is. And he, I believe, you could put a pumpkin bomb here and it would flick and throw. So each of these, not only were they designed to be accurate to the comic, they also had a play feature so that kids could enjoy them as well. A few more examples of that. Here's the Shocker. Another really great paint scheme. I mean, he really does look exactly like what he looked like on the cartoon. He came with little, blasters that would come out of his Shocker arms. Of course, he doesn't have elbow articulation to allow for that action feature, but I mean, this was a solid Shocker figure. Now, I'm going to mix and match some things because as the line went on, we moved away from purely animated looks to some more comic looks. And so here is the Scorpion that came out a little bit later in the 5-inch line. Look at how freaking awesome that Scorpion tail is. And it does have a wire in there, so you can get it into all of those cool Scorpion poses. A little bit of added articulation with ball shoulders. But this one is a much more comic look. I think this really kind of represents the artwork of Eric Larson during his time on Spider-Man. But you can see how these 5-inch figures continued to evolve. Here's kind of a midpoint figure, still more animated with this tarantula, but increased articulation at the shoulder. Still has just sort of the regular V joints there. A little bit of soft goods to make his like bandana mask work. Really, really sweet. And we got some figures that we really haven't seen quite as much in later lines. Here's Jack-o'-lantern, and he came on like his flying pogo stick, and you can see that his hips and knees are bent in a way so that he can fit onto that. But look at how great that Jack-o'-lantern head is with that changing color translucent fire effect on top. I don't know that any of the stuff that's come from Toy Biz or Hasbro have really topped the look of this particular Jack-o'-lantern figure. Same thing for the classic Beetle. I still think we could use an improvement on our classic Beetle figure, but that has a very, very early look to it. Love that figure. We got some Spideys in here. Here we go. So while the original animated line, Doc Ock, did look like the McDonald's toy, later on they gave us a much more comic accurate version. And he's kind of cool. Look at how his arms, they bend, but they also like compress. It's like it's almost like one of those bendy straws, how those things work. But it really does let you kind of adjust the size of his tentacles. And what a fantastic head sculpt on this figure. He's a little funky at the waist, but it's covered up by this drape that he has down there, which is kind of, I guess, like a lab coat that he has going on. Here's another less common Spidey villain, but one that played a huge role in the Kraven's Last Hunt storyline. This is Vermin. And to my knowledge, this is the only Vermin figure that we've gotten. And because Vermin is actually a little bit of a smaller figure, this 5-inch scale, I think it could actually work in your Marvel Legends display. Now, everybody's favorite movie star, Morbius, got a figure in the animated line, very much in his animated look. Oh, yeah. Here we go. So it's always interesting how Spider-Man's spider sense is depicted on screen. We know in the comics it's like a little wiggle that's drawn up above his heads. But in the 90s animated cartoon, when Spidey's spider sense went on, his color scheme like inverted. And he went to this more purple and black, changed the eyes. And so this figure actually was meant to represent his spider sense. Look at how weird those hip joints are. Again, I appreciate the effort put into trying to give us more range of motion, but God, how weird. But what a great Spider Sense Spider Man. This box is just so full of surprises. Maybe none of them more shocking than the only figure we've ever gotten of Swarm. So, Swarm is a really obscure Spider Man bad guy who is made up of like millions of bees. And when you get down in this translucent plastic, you can see the texture that represents all the bees that make up this incredibly goofy villain, but one that we've only ever seen in this animated line at the 5-inch scale. Great cape, great head sculpt, but I love that translucent plastic to represent, you know, his body. Another figure that we've only gotten in the animated line is the Spider Slayer. So this was a pretty cool storyline that they ran on the cartoon, and they really brought it to life very nicely with a really accurate Spider Slayer. Now, this thing clearly is a ripoff of Alien and the the aliens from those movies, but that's okay. It's still a pretty cool Spider Slayer. Here is the Vulture. And yes, I believe this was the second Vulture that they did, but this is the one that really nailed the old man look, the hunched shoulders, the liver spots on his head, while still giving us that really old man thin body with the wings. Oh, I love this comic Vulture so much. Look at that hook of his nose. Look at this. He even has kind of his waddle is sculpted to kind of look like the underside of the neck of a vulture. That's detail, man. I mean, that is really getting after it with perfection of sculpting. God, I love that. Another very obscure Spidey villain that only appeared in this line was Scarecrow. Yeah, I know DC's probably calling, wanting to know, hey, we'd like our copyright back, but this is a very well sculpted, 7 POA Scarecrow with an extremely creepy Scarecrow head. So cool. We have gotten Silver Sable in the 6-inch line, but we haven't gotten her with a vac metal costume, and this thing still shines. Look at how the light bounces off of that Silver Sable costume. She's got a little knife in her holster. She has a sidearm here, ball shoulders, really, really choice. Love it. That's a good one. We'll get to that here in just a second. Here's the Chameleon, the first kind of super criminal that Spider-Man ever fought, and he came with alternate heads that you could pop on and off. We're used to this now. This is something that's become standard, but in the mid-90s, that was a pretty unique feature. Here's the animated version of Mysterio. And he had like a water blast effect. You could put like a pump in here and it would squirt out through the eyes that are on the chest of his costume. But again, while that is really accurate to the cartoon, it's pretty accurate to the Steve Ditko version of Magneto, of Mysterio as well. Now, some of the characters actually made the jump from the comic story into the cartoon, and one of those is the Red Skull. Now, you don't think of the Red Skull as being a Spider-Man bad guy, but he was actually implicated in the death of Peter's parents, Benjamin or Richard and what's his mom's name? Mary Parker, I believe. They were spies, and the Red Skull actually was part of their death when they were spies, and so they included that in there. So here we get a classic Cap villain in the 5-inch line, but in the Spider-Man line. Tombstone, a character that goes way back in the Spidey comics. He first appeared in the Spectacular Spider-Man comic, and he had a backstory involving Robbie Robertson, the associate editor of the Daily Bugle. Really cool figure. Speaking of the Daily Bugle, let's grab the man himself, J. Jonah Jameson. And yes, I know that we got a relatively recent 6-inch J. Jonah Jameson, but there's something about this one that I love. I love how he's posed like he's walking forward, like his feet, he's coming after you with that finger pointed out, yelling at you. I mean, this is truly an action figure. They have this sculpted so that you have JJ in an action pose. His vest is like billowing out because he's in motion. His tie's down. He's yelling. He's got his classic 50s flat top. Oh man, that is a great picture, a great figure. And I think he actually came with a newspaper as well, a crumpled up Daily Bugle that came with him. Here is the Rhino. Really good, really great Rhino head sculpt on this one. Again, he is definitely bigger. Like he is so much bigger than your standard 5-inch figure, which is great. It gives that mass to the Rhino. And with these ball shoulders, you can get him into some better poses. Black Cat made an appearance in the animated line and pretty well captured her animated look. Nice flowing hair, good black and white costume. Hard to go wrong with that. You know, I got to talk about the person that I consider to be Spider-Man's greatest villain, and that is the Green Goblin. Now, the animated series, if I remember correctly, started out with Hobgoblin as being Spidey's kind of number one goblin bad guy. And of course, that's backwards from what we had in the comics. But what that meant was when we finally got the Green Goblin, he was one of the later figures, and it's so much better. Look at how great that sculpt is. But I love the fact that he's shooting his Goblin Blast. This is the only Goblin figure that comes with his finger out where he can shoot that Goblin Blast. And of course, he had a play feature where he could throw his pumpkin bomb as well. So awesome. Bright colors. Really, really cool. Now, as we move forward in the Sony Spider-Man universe, there's a lot of rumblings that Madam Web is going to play a huge role. And she played a big role at the end of the cartoon line. And can you believe they actually gave us a Madam Web figure? Yes, we got a figure of an old lady with, no real articulated legs sitting in a super funky wheelchair. A blind gray-haired lady right there. Unbelievable. The only regret I have about Madam Web is that they didn't find a way to reuse this head and give us an Aunt May. That would have been really cool. But again, so far in the 5 and 6 inch scale, this is the only Madam Web figure that we've gotten. Again, here's a couple of more examples of sort of figures that evolved over time. So we did get a lizard in the animated style, but I really prefer this comic style lizard. Look at how great this is with his billowing lab jacket, big long tail, and this head that is straight out of a Todd McFarlane drawing. When Todd McFarlane revolutionized the look of Spider-Man in the comics, he also took a big stab at some of Spidey's most iconic villains, the Lizard being one of them. And this action figure perfectly captures that. I love that he's got his name badge on there. I love that he's in this like twisted attacking pose so that when you have him on a shelf, again, he's got this toe up, so he's coming at you. He's always going to be like moving right at you. That's so cool. Another figure that got an upgrade from his original animated version was the Sandman. And this one has his cool sand hammer. He's got a big sand fist. His foot actually kind of gives that coming out of the ground sand. And that actually helps this figure to stand, which was a really nice touch because when you have this hammer way out here, having this extra base plate of sand really keeps that figure upright. And again, he's got that super cool Steve Ditko haircut that I think only Steve Ditko has ever seen on a human being, but somehow he gave it to Sandman and Norman Osborn and numerous other figures. A couple of more before we move on to our next cartoon. We have got this is the Toy Fair magazine exclusive mail away Molten Man. Now, Molten Man has recently been announced to be in the Amazon 5-pack, so we are going to get an official Molten Man figure in the 6-inch line. But other than that, you had to mail away for this bad boy in one of the very first issues of Toy Fair magazine. And I love the metallic, the gold swirl on this. So cool. I don't know that it's going to be topped. I mean, that paint job just really is so spectacular. I don't know that the new Molten Man is going to be better than that. And I think I see one more. Of course, Electro. Electro is another one that had kind of a second version, and this one is a more kind of 90s comic accurate version. He comes with this crazy, accessory that fits on here, but I kind of like him just plain. Again, he has almost an Eric Larson look to his head sculpt, and oh, that's just so great. They did such a good job getting all of Spidey's main bad guys, as well as some super obscure ones, into the line. But for me, without a doubt, my favorite Spider-Man cartoon was Spectacular Spider-Man. This only lasted 2 seasons, and yet we still got a full component of figures from it. And this was the first Spider-Man that came out in the Spectacular Spider-Man line. Let's see if we can grab a couple of more, because I think it's worthwhile to make the comparison of how this figure evolved over time. So here's the first one, and it's a good figure. It has that Spectacular Spider-Man head. He has the very thin body, and he's got good articulation. You know, with that larger head, larger hands, larger feet, you give him the proportions of a teenager. And so they managed to capture that with this figure. But clearly they looked at this and they're like, no, those web lines are kind of way too close together. Those web lines don't match these web lines. We've got to do better. So they did. So the next version of Spider-Man from Spectacular Spider-Man was this one. Now we have an even more accurate head sculpt with that very distinctive shape of the head that the animators drew on Spectacular Spider-Man. Here you can see the web lines are much more spaced out, which again is far more accurate to the comic. And there's even more articulation. You still have all of those ball joints. You've got a twist at the wrist, but now you've got a diaphragm cut. And these ball hips can really get into some super crunchy poses. So this was a big step up in Spidey figures. So what did they do from there? They made it even better with the third Spider-Man. Now, at first glance, you might think, wait a minute, that's just the same as the previous figure. And there's a lot of similarities. Obviously, the head is very similar, but now we've got butterfly joints at the shoulder. We have more of a rocker joint here at the diaphragm, which provides for a bigger range of motion. The wrists have much more, they go every direction, including a mid forearm swivel and that bend at the wrist. And of course, that feature that everybody is clamoring for, toe joints. That's right, you can get Spidey up on his tippy toes. So you can see how the incredible evolution from, even with only 2 seasons of a cartoon, you went from this really good Spectacular Spider-Man figure to this absolute piece of perfection that they had. But Spider-Man's all about his bad guys, and we got a ton of them, beginning with the Lizard. So these figures are super, super accurate to the cartoon. They have great movement. He's got his name badge. He's got an articulated tail that bends at 4 different points and swivels all the way around. I love these big giant feet, so you can get him kind of into more of those, again, lizardy poses. So good. The lessons learned from that original animated Sandman were put to good use here, because his sand feet give him a strong base so that he can have these huge appendages, these giant hands. And again, absolute perfection as far as bringing together the look of the animated series. Now, one of the things that I thought was so great about Spectacular Spider-Man was how the bad guys were interwoven and intertwined. And no better example of that are the things that happened at Oscorp, where Otto Octavius was working. And this is our first Dr. Ock figure from when he kind of first gained his powers. He still has like his belt attached to his mechanical arms. He's kind of menacing, but you know, initially he was sort of a reluctant bad guy, but he evolved as the show went on into a much more sinister, much more threatening evildoer. Look at the change in his mechanical tentacles. Look at just the size of his belt, and just the overall shape and menace of this figure. I'm so glad that this is one that actually got a redo in the series, because this is much more accurate to what Doc Ock became as things went on. Now, all of those bad guys were kind of tied together. Of course you had Adrian Toomes, the Vulture, who was fired by Norman Osborn. And here we take some of those Vulture looks from the first animated series and from the cartoon and really take them even farther. Look at how his nose essentially forms a beak and how, his head is jutted forward the way a vulture does. Really cool effect with the wings when his arms are down there together, but then they can come up into more of a striking pose. Very, very sweet figure. And then the man who was really behind most all of it would be the Green Goblin, who initially was thought to be Harry Osborn, but as the seasons went on, we know he was revealed as Norman. He did come with a Goblin glider, which I have right here, but great, great Green Goblin figure. Again, purple and green, just terrific. He has that frame that matches the ears kind of poking out. I love it. But as good as they are when they're small, man, look how great they are big. Look at this, just the broad chest of this rhino figure. So cool. And he does something when you squeeze his legs. I think he like gets down into a rhino stance. But I love that. Much like we saw the hook nose on Vulture, here's the opposite on the rhino. So cool. And of course, perhaps the most well done part of the Spectacular Spider-Man story, Eddie Brock's Venom. So because they had the advantage of taking all of the continuity from the original comics, from the Ultimate Spider-Man comics and previous cartoons, they were really able to build the backstory of the relationship between Peter Parker and Eddie Brock, and then combine that with Kurt Connor's lab, Gwen Stacy, to give Venom a much more meaningful backstory, so that when Parker and Brock were going at it, they were like brothers fighting, and it just you felt it so much more. It was one of the things, the interwoven storylines, the well thought out long-term plot of Spectacular Spider-Man that really makes it, bar none to me, the best Spider-Man cartoon. Let me know what you think of Spectacular Spider-Man in the comments, and if you agree that it is the best animated version of the wall crawler. A few more from that line include Electro. Now, Electro's cool. You can definitely see kind of where this figure and this design influenced the Jamie Foxx version of Electro. He has a head somewhere down in the bottom of this. We'll try to find it later, but you can pop the blowing up Electro head out for more of a masked head. Of course, he comes with a play feature because, again, these are toys for kids. Same thing for Shocker. Here's a really sweet Shocker. Shocker's storyline kind of got mixed in with the Enforcers, which again was cool. It kind of kept it to where it made sense that things, continued on. He had cool sort of Shocker things, and I love that. I love the see-through aspect of his goggles there, because that does look exactly like what he looked like on the cartoon. Now, that show had some tie-ins, toy tie-ins as well. So let's look at a few different kind of Happy Meal toys. Here's a Spidey with a web blast. Here is a suction cup Spidey. And these are good, man. I mean, they really do look like Spectacular Spider-Man from the cartoon. Here's a black suit that actually comes on a web line. So that's always a pretty cool touch. Here's another black suit that I guess tracks. I think maybe if you roll him backwards, yeah, he'll like race across the floor. So that's pretty cool. And nice. All right, couple more versions of Spidey from this. Here's like Spidey fighting Doc Ock, I guess, some kind of Ock battling armor. I don't always get all the different versions of Spider-Man from some of these lines that were aimed at kids, but this one was cool enough that I grabbed it. And another one that I know that I grabbed is this one, because this figure absolutely looked exactly like the art from Steve Scroce's time on Amazing Spider-Man when he created an Electro suit armor. So Spidey had a suit that looked almost virtually identical to this in the Amazing Spider-Man comics when he battled Electro. So I had to grab that for its comic accurate nature. So really, really cool. And one more red and blue Spidey. This one has that first Spidey body, but we get a super cool Peter Parker head, just exactly like what we saw on the show. Very, very choice. But of course, I mentioned the Venom storyline. Well, the Venom storyline can't happen without the saga of the alien costume. And so on the cartoon, Peter comes in contact with the alien costume and it takes over. And at first, it really mimics his red and blue suit. You can see it still maintains the lines of the costume. The spider here is changed. It was more closer to his red and blue. But this figure, you can see, still has all of the web lines on it. But as the symbiote took over Peter and began to really kind of take over his personality, turn him more evil, the suit changed. And so we got to see more of, actually, let's look at this one first, of this version of the suit. A little bit smaller spider, but gone are the web lines. Now it's just solid black. And so while this one is really good, I think these eyes are kind of funky, but thankfully, much like with the red and blue, they never stopped improving and they gave us this one. Look at how much more show accurate this head sculpt is compared to this one. Just the shape of the head gets back to that really kind of, asymmetrical head that they had on the show. He's got the bigger spider. He's lost the web lines. And this is what the black suit Spider-Man looked like from Spectacular Spider-Man. So freaking good. I absolutely love it. I've got like 2 more black suits in here. I've got another. Oh, I've got a red and blue where I tried to make his eyes even more Ditko. I tried to draw on them. That's why I don't try to customize. Okay, a couple of more things. We did have, after, I believe it was Spider-Man 2, we had some of these figures that came out that were tied in with the video game. So here's a video game version of Mysterio, Kraven the Hunter. We got a black cat with her hair back into a ponytail. Actually, a really cool Rhino, which is pretty reminiscent of the Ultimate Comics version of Rhino. And we also got Lizard and Shocker. And man, I tell you, that's a pretty accurate Shocker. I mean, that could certainly pass for a comic Shocker. Oh, and one more. We got Scorpion. Now, this is definitely a very different version of Scorpion than what we're used to seeing. So it was cool to actually get it in 3-dimensional form. Along with that, there have been a couple of other Spidey cartoons. I think these come from the Ultimate Spidey cartoon. I don't really love that show. Here's kind of just the basic Spider-Man, and then here's like an Iron Spider version of that. Not my favorite. I never really have watched it. Guys, if I'm missing out, tell me about it. Let me know if I need to go back and watch that. But here's just a couple of more kind of animated Spideys. I did want to show you that Electro mask. So this is the one that fits. You can switch out Electro's head and put him in more of his containment mask. That's very cool. But I saved one figure for last, and that's one that I'm not sure as many people are familiar with. This is from the MTV animated Spider-Man cartoon. Now, that Spidey cartoon was a freaking 90s kid's wet dream. Spider-Man was voiced by Doogie Howser, MD. Harry was voiced by Steve from Beverly Hills 90210. And it was, I guess, Gwen or MJ, I think it was maybe MJ, was voiced by Lisa Loeb, who sang Stay. So, I mean, it was like every 90s dream come true. But you can see what they did was they took that Spider-Man movie costume with the very distinctive spider on the back, and they created an animated look for it. And the way the light shines off it, it brings out these silver highlights. I have always loved this, kind of fairly obscure Spidey animated figure. I just think it's so well done in its proportions. And that cartoon was like fully computer generated. It was really funky and it didn't last. I mean, it was in the wrong spot. MTV was, trying to be super cool and get into more regular programming, but it just didn't really find a home there. But I'm awfully glad that we got this Spidey from it.
What was your favorite version of Spidey in cartoon form? Let me know in the comments. And as always, for the very best in comics history and action figures, like and subscribe to Carbon Scoring.